All right, a big hello to everyone. Welcome to the Stepping Out series, a podcast all about ordinary people just like you and me who have stepped out into the extraordinary despite the odds. My name is Anna Gray, and I'll be your host today. And my sincere hope is as you listen, that you'll be both inspired and equipped to step out into the call of God on your life. Today, we have Jonathan David Hatto.
Whoa, come on.
I
The
know, I
full
know
the full name.
the full name. John and I work together, so it's good. Well, let's see how different this is to everything else we've done.
Yeah.
Um, he's the exec pastor at Hillsong Canada, and just a phenomenal guy who is he, he's a young guy, but his maturity is just far beyond his years. So I'm really pumped for people to hear your story.
I really appreciate that you called me young. I'm kind of getting up there now. So I've got a 12-year-old and that makes me feel old. So there you go.
Yeah, but you had kids when you were young as well.
I did. I was 23. Yeah.
Yeah, and people are getting married at like 30 now. So
It's true. It's true. And actually we found that that's a real space for us
mhm.
just to hang out in. There's guys my age that are just having kids and we're already 12 years on that journey. It's pretty wild. It's pretty wild.
You feel like you had to grow up faster than everyone else?
I definitely felt like I had to grow up. I don't really remember like comparing it to anybody else. It's
Right.
just wild to me because we youth pastored for 6 years before I'm doing what I'm doing now, and so that like being a youth pastor and like spending time with other people's 12-year-olds, and now I have my own 12-year-old, like this preteen like crazy world that I'm going into. So it's pretty nuts. It's one thing to minister to it; it's another thing to live with it,
Yeah,
24/7.
right. Because you can send them home at the end of the night.
That's it. Fill someone else's kids full of candy and then send them home. Yeah,
Yeah, that's right. That's awesome.
yeah, good times.
Yeah. So with that, so I'd love to. I think it'd be really interesting to hear. So what has your journey kind of been up until now? Like, you've come into ministry and you're in the position you're now. But what has the journey been uh, since growing up? I'd be curious to actually hear what your teenage years were like and growing up was like. And did you ever think you would end up doing what you're doing today?
I mean, I grew up in church. My dad was a pastor. So when I was really young, I remember my dad going to Bible college when I was like 4 or 5 years old.
Hmm.
He worked for Youth for Christ, now in Canada known as Youth Unlimited, and so he did that. And I always remember him doing youth conferences and youth talks and going into schools and doing assemblies, things like that. Just trying to make the gospel super accessible for kids. And then he went to Bible college. We were part of a church plant, so that's kind of been a theme for me all the way
Interesting.
through. It's just
Mm.
that kind of emerging congregation space. And so I just grew up in church. I grew up going to youth, serving in church. I remember probably my earliest memory of like actually helping out in church. I served on production,
Oh wow.
helped out all the guys my age that were showing up, 7 a.m. bumping into a school gym. Um, they taught me a little bit of production and things like that. And then yeah, like I grew up, doing youth and things like that, getting involved and helping out teaching younger kids, like especially in the junior high age group. And then when I left home, I went to college in Sydney, Hillsong College in Sydney, and that was really, I think, for me where the call became real. Like there was a season at
Hmm.
the end of high school where I felt like God really got a hold of my heart. I became a Christian when I was 12, but I kind of really wrestled with it through those teen years, junior high into high school, trying to
Yeah.
figure it out, trying to navigate peer pressure, and you know how it is, right? Like when you grow up in church, there's just these two worlds colliding, right?
Mm.
And
It's pretty hard to reconcile sometimes, hey?
it really is, it really is, and especially when your dad's a pastor and he's coming into your school to do assemblies, like that's
Oh,
pretty
nice.
wild,
Oh, wow. How big was your
you know.
school?
So my first high school was about 1,400 kids. So it was pretty good sized school. But then when we moved to a different part of England. My dad took on a different church. Not as many people knew. He didn't come into that school very often. But by that point, people were asking, "Oh, like, why did you move?" I had an accent again, a theme of my whole life is having had an accent wherever I've gone. And so people are always asking, oh, like, why did you move from where you are to where you are now, right? And
Mm,
so there was always that church piece in there. I was
yeah.
always pretty open about it. It didn't really bother me. Um,
Mm,
but yeah, so when I graduated college, I actually had met my now wife, Ange. She also did college. We met in Sydney. She's from Canada. I'm from England, and
mm,
we were actually in Sydney. We were walking around a park. We were really praying. We knew we were going to get married. We were praying about where we wanted to settle, where we felt like God was calling us to settle, and we felt like Canada was the place. I'd
mm,
never been here, so that was pretty intense for me to kind of come here for the first time, and uh, we were going to get married here, and we just kind of got involved with the church that she was from before college, and
right.
I I couldn't work. I didn't have a work permit at the time, so I was just volunteering, basically volunteering full time with,
Yeah.
with the youth pastor at the church, and just got involved there. And yeah, it just kind of took off. Like it just went, you know, from there. We always had a connection with our pastors, Damien and Julie. Like we'd known them in Sydney. We
Mm-hmm.
spent time with them even when we were youth pastor. And if we had a Sunday off, we'd come be a part of what was then Vantage Church, the church that they'd planted. And and so when we felt like it was a change of season for us, uh,
Mm,
they were actually one of the couples we reached out to and said, "Hey, like,
mm,
what do you think? Like, speak into our lives a little bit. Give us a bit of wisdom." And
mm.
it just felt really clear. Like, okay, this is where we need to be. We need to be with them, building church with them. And so yeah, it's been a bit of a roller coaster for the
Mm-hmm.
last like 15 years. Really
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah. I think the interesting thing about chatting to you versus someone who may be in their 20s right now is you've done a change in season,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Versus before you were in Woodstock, now you're here in Toronto. How do you know when it's time to change season?
Hmm.
Like, there is like, it feels like, you're called to ministry, but now it's like, okay, now like, let's get into the nuances of what it looks like and which church you're aligning yourself in, which leaders you're aligning yourself in, the location and all that stuff. How do you know when it's time to change season?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that we wrestled with for, I would say, probably 18 months to 2 years. We When we moved and we actually planted ourselves, we really felt like the word that we had from God was to go and sow our lives in at this other church, which is a pretty significant word, right? When you feel like, okay, this is what I'm building my
Mm-hmm.
life on. And obviously that means putting your roots down. It means staying faithful, being consistent, and in general, that's always been a theme of my life. It's like I don't tend to like flip between different things. Like if I'm there, I want to be there.
Mm,
Um, and I've always just sensed like if it's going to be a change of season, that rather than what I feel like, it's actually going to be, has God called me to move on? Have I
mm,
have I sensed something different? Have I sensed like a release in my heart and in my
mm-hmm.
spirit to actually move? And so there was the very very real dynamic of what we were walking through in that previous season as youth pastors. We had grown a lot. Like I'm really grateful for that season. We were,
Mm-hmm.
like I said, we were there for 6 years, and I learned a lot
Wow.
about local church ministry. I learned a lot about, even taking some of the principles that I learned in college, in a effectively what was a mega church, in Australia, um, to then actually taking that and applying
Mm,
it in a smaller church setting.
that's very
Um,
cool.
yeah, for context, it was probably around, when we moved, it's probably around 400 people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so just understanding that it takes time to build credibility in a space like that. It takes time to really filter through the things that you've learned to actually then
Mm,
apply them in a different context. Um,
mm-hmm.
so we learned a lot about ourselves. We learned a lot about our ministry, what it is we were good at. We got experience. I got experience on a smaller scale, preaching and things like that.
Yeah.
One of the things that we really did sense though was that we'd hit a bit of a ceiling, and I think sometimes that happens, right? Maybe the leadership over us, or just the pace at which we are growing. all right, we are willing to grow. Especially you've got that kind of growth mindset. Not everybody has that, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that's important to recognize. But from a place of humility, and so I think it's important to understand like there are going to be times where you do seem to hit that ceiling, and so then the question is, what do you do with that?
Right.
Um, and so for us, we really wrestled with it. I didn't just kind of throw in the towel and be like, well, I'm out. So we really sought counsel. We really went after like the advice of people in our world. So we reached out
Mm-hmm.
to, like I said, to Damien and Julie Bassett, who we'd done some life with from a distance, and they were people that we really trusted. There were a couple other pastors that were really making a significant difference in that kind of southern Ontario area
Yeah.
that we had again our paths had just crossed, and so we reached out and I just sat down and had coffee with them and I just said, listen, like this is where we're at. And actually, it was interesting because one of them, so obviously the Bassetts were lead pastors. One of the other people was a lead pastor. Then the other person was an executive pastor.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also reached out to a guy who is pretty high up in an insurance company in Canada, like executive level. And so just kind of trying to get a broad sense of like what is leadership, what is the leadership experience supposed to look like at this
Mm-hmm.
at this level? What is it? Am I being? And I'm the biggest question was, am I being fickle? Like by wanting
Mm-hmm.
to move, am I actually have I done you know what's necessary in this space?
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
to try and work through the issues, because I think that's often the thing, right? We throw in the towel, we're quick to quit,
Mm-hmm.
and actually, I think consistency is something that is super underrated in leadership and in our culture, especially at the moment. Um, and so for me, it was just really wrestling with those conversations, and so it took probably 18 months for us to really
Wow.
figure that out. Um,
Do you feel
and if
like
you
you
you know
prolonged it or it was appropriate amount of time?
I don't know if I prolonged it. I probably stuck it out the appropriate amount of time, but I do remember my soul getting really tired.
Hmm.
And I remember coming home from work some days and just being, just kind of pouring it out to Ange, my wife, and just being like, I'm so done with this. I'm frustrated with this, and but again, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't just me and some stuff that
Mm-hmm.
hadn't dealt with. It was actually stuff that was bigger than just me. But
Mm-hmm.
I think probably the one thing I did learn, um, probably the hard way and the wrong way, is I don't, if I could do it over again, I would finish a lot better than I did.
Right.
I think what happened was that my soul getting tired, sometimes those things spill out, right? And your language is not the greatest. The way you talk to people or about people is not the greatest. And that's,
Yeah.
I think you've got to really be intentional with that. If okay, like I've got a set window of time that I'm transitioning, you got to be really wise in how you communicate to people around you, even if you're
Mm.
frustrated with them or frustrated with the system. So that can be really tricky, because obviously how we've always talked about how you finish one season is how you're going to start the next one.
It's very true.
So if you burn the bridges in the last season, um, it's not super helpful for the next season.
Hey, I hope you're getting a ton of value from this podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, would you like and subscribe? If you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, would you rate, review, and share this podcast with your friends? It would mean the world to me and it helps the word get out. Now back to the show. Yeah, because it's such a tough thing transitioning because I think sometimes you can try running away from it. It's that quote, right? Like wherever you go, there you are.
Yes.
And it's you go through life and then you find out it's like, oh, always had really crappy housemates.
Yeah.
They're like, or I always had really crappy relationships.
Mm,
I mean, I wonder who's a common denominator in all of this, right? It's your
it's true.
selection. And so it is interesting, right? Like actually dealing with your stuff quite fast and being slow to run away from situations. Um, because yeah, you could definitely make the transition and be frustrated at this in a church, for example, if you're under someone's leadership, and then suddenly go to the next church and be frustrated about the same thing and not realizing there's actually stuff in your own life you need to deal with and
hmm
maybe we're the problem, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think there's lessons that I've learned even in this season where
Hmm.
I think back or I look back and I think, okay, if I had approached certain aspects of my leadership differently in the previous season, would I have gotten as tired as I did? Would I have gotten as frustrated as I did? And so, yeah, it really is easy to look at it and say it was this person's fault, but actually thinking through, there's things that I could have done differently too, right?
Hmm.
Um, but for me, just feeling like actually God was gracious
Hmm.
that He redeemed that previous season, and He's kind of brought us into this season where we're really flourishing as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of the story actually in First Kings 12, and it's after Solomon, there's Rehoboam, and so Solomon's been leading with wisdom, and then his son Rehoboam comes into power, and he has to make a decision, right, about I don't remember the story exactly the way it is, but he just has to make quite a large decision. And so he
Mm,
has access to Solomon's elders and Solomon's people who help to make decisions. And then he has access to his buddies. And so
hmm
he listens to the elders' advice, rejects it, and then follows his friends' advice, who are essentially saying, put even a heavier yoke on the people, right? Like make sure you let them know who's boss. And
hmm
actually, if you really trace it in the Bible, like that's actually one of the key moments that led to the split of northern and southern Israel, right? Like it came
Yeah.
from that moment, and people were affected by that. And so it's it's so important, right? Like even as you were saying, like getting the counsel that you need. Like I was even thinking in my head, I'm like, all right, like what is actually good faithful Christian decision making, right? Like the Bible does point to, yeah, yes, use scripture, but also does point to counsel,
hmm
but also does point to prayer and being discerning with the Holy Spirit. And it's kind of like all of these three elements are kind of doing like a dance together. And it's hard to separate all of them. You know what I mean? Because I mean, I've also seen some people who purely go by counsel without prayer and scripture. I've seen people who purely go to scripture, which is great, but you need people to work with you to understand what's happening, right? Because you can like
hmm
flick and pick whatever scripture you want and be like, it's time to go, and or
Yeah.
it's time to do this decision. Or
hmm
some people can be like, well, I felt the Holy Spirit saying X, which is
hmm
great and all power to it. But again, right, if it's not in alignment with scripture, um, you're really got to ask yourself some serious questions, right? And so,
Yeah.
so it does feel right, like counsel, prayer, and scripture, all three of them with due diligence, making those big decisions. And I think just the peace, and I'm sure you've felt it, and I felt it in my own life, the peace you get knowing that you've done that due diligence, it's
hmm
irreplaceable, right? And it
Yeah.
sustains you for the season.
hmm Yeah. Just as you're talking, I think about there was a message that I heard, um, and some of you probably still find it on YouTube. It was a Stephen Furtick message, and it was "Don't stop on six." And so he was
Mm,
obviously talking about Jericho and the Israelites going around the walls of Jericho. And I remember listening to this message and thinking, okay, God, is this a word from you? Because I'm in my sixth year of youth ministry. I'm at sixth year of being in this space, and so the timing of hearing that message, it really caused me to test my own heart, right? Like, is this actually a word from God? Um, and I remember really wrestling with that, and I think sometimes it's easy to put all the weight on one thought or one scripture or one person's opinion.
mm,
And at the same time, what it began to cause me to do was to think through, at the end of the day, the decision is still mine.
yeah,
And I think sometimes what we do is we make a decision, and then if it goes south, we blame God for it, or we blame somebody else for it,
yeah, right.
like we were saying before. And what I began to realize was that even if this was a word from God, in my heart, had I already transitioned, had I already moved, the season hadn't changed yet.
That's a good
But
point.
sometimes I think what happens is we leave in our heart, and we don't, we're we're already checked out. So we're praying,
Mhm.
we're saying, okay, God, like help me make this decision. But actually, we've already made the decision in our heart. We've already felt that, okay, like even if I stick around, I'm not going to be here fully present. And I think at that point, it's actually healthier to maybe sometimes move on, because if your heart has already checked out, um, what are you bringing to that space? I think you can realign your heart and you can realign your spirit to
Yeah,
a
totally.
point. It is doable if you do the hard work and you really get it right. Um, but I just really remember in that season, it really caused me to ask, okay, like, am I sticking it out for the sake of
Hmm.
what I feel like is God saying this to me, or am I sticking out because actually I want to be here?
Yeah.
And and so what I realized was, I was thinking about that whole idea of whether you turn to the left or to the right, you know, God's with me, right? God's
It's true.
blessing, going to bless me, and I'm going to experience His favor. And so one of the pieces of counsel that we really got was from this guy who was an executive pastor, and he'd also been he used to work for RIM, making Blackberries, but this guy was like a gun. He would look after a bunch of their top 100
Hmm.
accounts, and so he had that experience in both the business world and in ministry. And one of the things he said to me, he said, if you make a decision, especially as a married couple, he said, if
Mm.
you make a decision, make sure that you and your spouse are on the same page.
Yeah.
He said, even if you make a decision and your spouse is not with you, and it goes south, you're really on your own. But
Yeah.
if you make this decision and it's the wrong decision, but you've made it together, at least you're falling together, you're failing together. God is, there's a
Hmm.
unity in that space. And actually, I think there is a lot to be said. And again, I'm speaking to married couples,
Hmm.
but I think especially for guys, we don't always make decisions the way that our wives would make decisions. And so
Yeah.
one of the things I remember being taught was, actually, our wives tend to be a lot more discerning about certain things. I forget who it was. I mean, maybe Lee Burns, someone like that. He said, "Oh, like, women have a flicky switch, and they're just aware. They're aware of certain things. They're sensitive to certain things that we maybe are not as guys."
Totally.
And so that was, obviously having my wife in that mix was a really big
Hmm.
portion of that council as well. Um, but yeah, it's definitely owning your own decision as well,
Hmm. Hmm.
and understanding, okay, like, I'm making this decision, whichever way I feel like God is leading me, I'm going to make this decision,
Hmm.
and and then actually owning that. I think that's the other piece of it, right? We make a decision, we own what
Yeah.
comes as a result of that.
Yeah. What's really interesting about that is, I think even before moving here to Canada, and I don't know if it wasn't from San Francisco as well, but I felt a bunch of like external pressure, right? Like, you get the counsel, you hear a couple of different opinions from people you trust. And I remember my therapist saying, and I was like, I just don't know what to do because it feels like, there's conflicted opinions and, like sometimes it is not always as such a clear consensus, right? It can still be
Mm-hmm.
awesome, whatnot. But he says, Anna, this is actually part of growing up and being a
Mm-hmm.
man, like actually making a decision yourself and owning it. And I actually
Mm-hmm.
remember even with a previous relationship I had, there was a whole bunch of conflicting stuff on it. But really, at the end of the day, the only person who has to live with their decision is you. Um,
That's right.
and it's such an interesting balance and nuance because yes, you want to listen to counsel. Like even when you think about the story of David, right? He got, I think it was who was in power before Saul was in power before David, and he was essentially saying, "Don't go fight Goliath." He actually denied the counsel, so that's such a interesting extra nuance to it, right?
Yes.
And he was told by people not to go, and so it's just such a, like, life is just so full of discernment, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
yes, you pray, you seek the scriptures, you ask for counsel, you get alignment. Well, I feel like the spouse piece feels pretty unbreakable more than anything else, in my
Mm-hmm.
opinion. Um, But then it's like you really just got to make a decision. And
Hmm.
especially I felt like for us people who are in our early 20s, like that is literally a part of growing up. Like I don't know if your parents are going to agree, don't know if your closest friends are going to agree. You just got to own the decision. But of course, in a
Hmm.
very respectful and thoughtful way. And I love the fact that you took a good amount of time to make that decision.
Hmm. Yeah, I think the alignment piece is really crucial because I think so. I was making this decision around 27, 28, and I've seen a lot of late 20 somethings go through this same experience. Like I thought, sometimes again when you're going through it, you feel like I'm the only person ever going through this.
Yeah.
But I have seen a lot of 20 somethings go through it at that 27, 28, maybe 30. Because I think what happens is that you come out of your teens and you're just supercharged. You're ready to take on the world, right? And then you spend those first kind of 6, 7 years, you know, maybe it's at school or really trying to understand more of what you are created for. And I think there's an element there where you start to then put your roots down and you're like, okay, where can I really make a difference? Where can I really push forward in this? Because you're about to enter into a season of your life. And this is not true for everybody, obviously, but you're trying to enter into a season of life where really through your 30s into your 40s you're gonna actually have a significant impact. There's a space there, and there's a
Mm,
maturity level. Again, I know I'm speaking to mainly to guys because that's obviously my experience. um, but I think there's that post 25 maturity that sets in that maybe is starting to fuel our thinking a bit more.
mm,
And so for me, one of the things that I really went through was actually having to learn that if I'm in an environment like an organization and I don't see eye to eye with the person leading that organization, it's not always an issue with the organization.
mm,
And I think there's something to be said there, and this is probably one of the lessons I learned from that season. Like I said before, I don't think I did it the best. I don't think I failed it completely, but there was definitely things I would do differently. Um, but one of the things that I did was I actually sat down with the leader of the organization as best I could, and that's not always an option if the organization's huge and you're not always
yeah.
you know direct report to the person that's leading. But I was in that space. I was able to sit down with the lead pastor and really chat through. Okay, here's where I'm struggling. Here's
Mm,
I want to be able to give my energy to this. I want to be able to align myself with this. Um, but here's where I'm struggling. What do you see?
right.
What do you see? And as I went on, I mean, for me, it was a very different church to what I'd grown up in. So I began to realize this is not a preference thing. It's not
Mm,
preferential behavior that was separating us. Actually, some of it was coming down to theology, right?
right.
And so I was beginning to realize that maybe the things that had been put into me as a young guy, some of the things that had been put into me through college, had actually caused, they'd affected my DNA, my leadership DNA, in a more substantial way than I had realized. And
Right.
so, what I began to learn, what I began to realize, is that if if I'm not in agreement with the organization and the culture and the DNA of the organization, that actually I'm the one that needs to move.
Mm,
And I think sometimes what we do in those late 20s years is because we're very cause driven. And this is, there are definitely times where the organization needs to shift and the organization needs to move forward. Um, but I think you have to really do that deep work of figuring out who am I? What is it that I've actually been called to do? What is my belief system? And again, a lot of what makes us who we are is woven through our
right.
through our past, right? So it's something I've always noticed. Something super simple example for me, but I grew up in England, very little ice, very little, nobody ever played hockey, and
Yeah.
yet I just had this like curiosity around ice hockey. Like I was like, I would, they showed one NHL game on a Sunday night at 3 a.m. I would stick in a VHS, a tape into the VHS. I would record that and I would watch the hockey game. And I bought skates and I played, shoot pucks in my driveway and things like that. And I'm like, what? what is this?
Hmm.
Only to then realize 20 years later that I'm living in Canada, I'm
Wow.
ministering in Canada, my kids are Canadian, like there's a, and so, but I think that's just a, a small
Mm.
um, example, but there are things in who we are that are woven through our childhood, woven through our young adult years that are actually a part of our future, right?
Mm-hmm.
That God has put those things into us. And so I think it's important to do the work of figuring out who actually am I,
Mm.
and finding an organization that we can align with. And so
Mm-hmm.
that was really for us. It was a telltale for us that whenever we took a Sunday off where we were, we came to be with Pastors Damien and Julie.
Right.
That they represented a culture that we understood, that we were like, I like this
Yeah.
environment. I
Right.
want to be a part of this environment.
Mm.
So in that season of transition, it was like, you really wrestle with it, but then all of a sudden you make the decision. You're like, this was a no brainer. Like, why didn't we figure this out right at the beginning? Um, but
Yes.
I think we had to learn some things through that season
Mm-hmm.
in order to get to the point of being able to settle it in our hearts when we did move.
Yeah. Very good. Um, yeah. I wanna transition a little bit. I had someone actually inbox me and ask this, but I want to ask you instead. This person said, "Would love to hear your thoughts on rest and what that is for you. I really struggle with getting things done before my Sabbath, plus balancing friends and introvert time."
Wow. Yeah,
We need the
that's
full
a big
answer
one.
in about 5 minutes.
Oh my goodness. Okay. I think again, I would say this is something that I've really wrestled with, and I've really had to learn, and still learning.
Hmm.
Um, I think I think sometimes when we are performance oriented, performance driven people and leaders, we actually have a really hard time shutting off because we feel like our worth is attached to what we do.
Hmm.
And one of the biggest lessons I had to learn was, you know, I am valuable for who I am, not just what I do.
Hmm.
And what I do is not who I am,
Mm.
if that makes sense. So my worth, my value before God, my worth, my value before people actually comes not in connection with the things that I'm able to perform as a
Mm.
as a job. And so for me, that was a real learning curve. And I would say that boundaries is a really huge part of that. It's actually knowing
Yeah.
that you're in an environment where you can say, okay, I need to create space here. And obviously there are seasons, right? Some seasons are going to be more intense. So, one of the lessons I learned early on in ministry, one of the pastors that our previous church really taught me this. He said, there's an ebb and flow to ministry.
Hmm.
So some seasons there's going to be, it's like the snow melts on the top of the mountain, and it's just like torrent
Yeah.
coming down the mountain. You're like you're on, and you're doing lots of things. And you and I, we know it. Christmas and Easter, like some of those key seasons in church life, that's what it looks like. We know that December is a big month,
Yeah.
and so then we need to understand. Okay, if in those flow seasons we've looked after ourselves, uh, then we're going to go into an ebb season.
Hmm.
It's still important to look after yourself, and vice versa,
Yeah.
right? And like I said before, I think consistency throughout the seasons is really important. So, you know, always trying to keep just a good sleep schedule.
Yeah.
Eating right, working out. Like you and I talk about this stuff all the time, right? But
Yeah.
it's things that again go underrated or underspoken. I think in a leadership environment, and actually, it's the things that really do make a great leader. Is if you can look after yourself
Hmm.
and you can learn how to what your limit is, And I shared this with a bunch of our leaders last month, but um, it's important to be able to say no to the right things, so
Right.
you can say yes to the right things,
Yeah.
And sometimes we don't even think about things. Okay, I've got to say yes to this opportunity and yes to this opportunity, and actually, what can happen is we say yes to everything, and then we actually have no energy for anything.
Hmm.
Whereas if you can pick those things that actually you are the best at, or,
Yeah.
again, I've got 3 kids, right? We went through a season of youth ministry where you're raising, you're trying to raise kids, and, you're helping raise other people's kids. It's a lot.
Hmm.
It is a lot. Um, and so you really got to create that margin. And I talked about the idea that a lot of us run at 100%, right? We pack our schedules, we
Yeah,
pack,
right.
our work balance. And so what happens is that when we have something go wrong, when there's chaos that enters the picture, it actually creates chaos because we've gone over our margin.
Yeah,
Whereas
right.
if we can look at our life and say, I want to live at 80%, we're not underperforming. We're actually leaving space so that if we then go over, if something happens, it's like carrying a glass of water up the stairs, right? If the glass of water is all the way to the top, you're going to spill it.
Yeah,
Doesn't matter
right.
how hard you
Mm.
try and keep it straight.
Hmm.
But if you can leave a little bit of margin at the top,
Mm-hmm.
then when you go around a corner or you kind of stumble a little bit, it's not going to go over the top of the glass. So I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of us need to really create that space. But yeah, sleep, eating right, exercising, making time for the people, those two or three people that are really life giving for us. I think those
Mm-hmm.
things are really important with
Yeah.
rest.
I know something that you do every Friday is go out on your bike, right? And just get out in nature and put on your EDM. I don't know if it's EDM music, whatever it is. I don't know. UK drill.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
But yeah, that's something you do on a weekly basis, which is like it's really cool that you found that thing that's like, it's your thing. I know you work out outside of that, but just on a Friday when the kids are at school, going for a bike ride and just getting that time out in the forest, right? Um,
Hmm.
yeah, it's incredibly important to try finding that space for it. I think actually one thing that you and Julie Bassett, who is our lead pastor at Hillsong Canada, told me, and I think at one point I had multiple nights of just church related things. And I think
Hmm.
both of you said to me, like, you shouldn't have more than two.
Hmm.
At the best, you
Yeah,
shouldn't have more than two. Again, there are seasons, but really,
yeah,
you really shouldn't have more than two on a regular schedule. I was like, huh, okay.
yeah.
And then just getting really creative with how you get those other things done, or and then being mindful if there is a season where something is happening on a weekly nightly basis, how can we flex? And
Hmm.
and it's just always and it's actually from John Marks Comer's book, and he says part of being human and being in submission to God is to recognize that you actually are a limited being.
Absolutely.
And he's like, and I heard someone else saying that I love sleep because it tells the world every single day you're not superhuman. You're going to need a nap just as much as the next person. As much as you can
Yeah.
say, I'm always on. I can keep going. No, it's like life is going to catch up with you. Maybe you can go 2 days without any sleep, but you are still a finite being. And I actually think like being humble before God is actually that recognition. And I remember Christine Kane used to say, some of you just need to tell God, uh, I know I've got a bunch of stuff going on, but I leave it into your hands and go sleep and
Yeah.
just rest. Because that's
Yeah.
that's actually it does actually feel like it feels like humility, and pride actually could actually look like worrying a bit more and staying up all night trying to
Hmm.
fix everything on your own terms, and just going to bed and saying, all right, well, God, I'm living in your hands, good night.
Yeah.
He's not
Yeah. I think it
sleeping.
was. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think it's John Ortberg. He says, I think it's in the life you've always wanted. He says, yeah, sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is take a nap.
it's so
I
true.
love that so much, right? I think, I don't know, we've come to just glorify overwork and busyness and all this stuff. And actually, as a leader, more and more, as you level up in ministry or business, whatever, you're not just paid for what you do, you're paid for who you are. And
Wow.
if you destroy who you are, what you do doesn't matter
Mm,
because you're gonna burn all those bridges anyway, right? So
yeah.
if you can take care of your soul and actually bring the best of who you are to every situation, you're going to see the compound interest of those decisions and those conversations and those different things that you're involved with. Um, and I think it's really important to realize that you are, we're not just in it for short haul. We're in it for the long haul. Like
That's
I
right.
say, I keep saying to my wife, like I want to still be living the dream and loving my life and loving the church in 60, 70 years time. I don't know how long
Yep.
I get, but I want to still be passionate I don't want to get to the end of, my
Mm-hmm.
40th year or my 50th year and just be toast. Like
Yeah.
what
Wow.
what benefit is that to anybody? And what benefit is that to my family?
Yeah.
Right? To my first ministry, my
Mm-hmm.
wife and my kids, like they deserve the best of me. God deserves the best of me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and my wife is a decorator, and we used to paint houses together before we got married, and then that first year of marriage. And I would always try and do as much as I could. Like I'd get a bit of paint on the roller and just like go nuts across this entire wall. And she's like, "Dude, it looks rubbish because you've spread yourself too thin, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like just use enough paint for that section of wall and then move on to the next one, right? Like because otherwise it doesn't cover properly and everything looks bad as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
trying to cut corners and keep the cost down.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, it ends up costing you a lot more in the long run.
Yeah. I'm definitely seeing this theme of, we've spoken a lot about what we're doing, right? And
Hmm.
that's one element I think of the God call on your life. But then it's also who you are and who you're becoming. Like that's immensely important. And it's such a challenge, right? Because it's like, are we willing to actually pull back what we're doing and all the external accolades and all that stuff so that we're living lives that actually look a lot like Jesus? Because I would rather, like, I think about my grandma. She passed away recently, and quote unquote, she didn't have all the external accolades. She didn't have a large church or a large ministry. There were a lot of people coming to her and coming to her house and calling her up all the time, and she'd pray for them and whatnot. But it was never anything. You know what I mean? She didn't get an award for anything or any public
Hmm.
recognition. But then I look at her life, and I'm like, that is a life well lived. I would rather do that versus the person who you know did all the big stuff, got the recognition, but then you find out that their internal life was just crumbling all along the way.
Hmm.
Like, what value is that? You could have spoken in every country in the world, but then if you come to the end of your life and then it turns out that it was your internal life was a mess the whole time.
Hmm.
It's really convicting because I think we do want to make a big deal about ourselves, and the internal things are so hidden that it is that kind of thing where it's like only God sees that thing and it worships God in private. There's no public worship of good job, Onagre. Like you're experiencing that peace, that joy, all that stuff. It's really only
Hmm.
benefits yourself and God, and God sees you in the secret place, right? Um,
Yeah.
that's hugely convicting. It's not just
Hmm.
about what we're doing in our life. It's who we're becoming, and God can do that a billion different ways.
Hmm. And I think too, when you think about ultimately, as a leader, you're replicating who you are.
That's right.
It's easy to delegate what you do, but actually, especially for us in ministry, right? We're
Hmm.
we're replicating who we are, and I think, I mean, let's be honest, we've seen several high profile leaders over the last 2 or 3 years who seem to be doing a fantastic job of replicating who they are, but then you see the damage that's caused on the flip side of that when it does all crumble. And I mean, I think there's something to be said there for putting our hope in humanity
Hmm.
instead of what we would say in a perfect God. But at the same time, it's I want to still be standing for the benefit of the people I'm leading.
Yeah. Right.
You know, I want my kids to see what it looks like to go the distance. Like we both got family members that have gone the distance, that are still going the distance, that still love Jesus. 60 years, whatever, on in the journey, and um, I, you know, I think we miss that sometimes, that phrase. Well done, my good and faithful servant. And
Hmm.
actually, what does faithfulness look like? Faithfulness doesn't necessarily look like hitting everything on your to do list. Um, and one of the things I realize is that there's always more to do. Like if you're in a leadership culture, if you're in a growth mindset, if you are in a space like that that's always just pushing the boundaries, um, there's always going to be more to do. And it
Hmm.
doesn't matter like how much you get done on that to-do list, especially if you're a leader. You're going to wake up the next day like, oh yeah, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this, and you can come up with a whole nother list of things you need to do. Or you work with people that are wired that way as well, and they're gonna keep putting stuff on you, not because they don't see that you need rest, but they're just bringing their leadership to the table,
Mm-hmm.
and you need to sometimes be actually able to say, you know what, this is a next week situation. I'm actually taking the day off, like,
Mm-hmm.
and just being aware of, even just, yeah, like you said, that space that you need for yourself to be.
Mm-hmm.
I just think it's fascinating that what's the first thing that God does for humanity, right? Is He
Mm.
gives them a day off.
Yeah, wow.
He's like, no, I'm going to create you into rest.
Yeah,
He
wow.
makes humanity on the sixth day, seventh day, God rested.
Mm.
So He's not saying, okay, like now you've got to go and work hard. Like if God has made us, He's also created us to
Yeah,
actually yeah, like you said, to realize we are finite
yeah,
and that we're not. We do need that space and that rest.
yeah. Awesome. Thanks, John. That was brilliant. That was really good and really helpful. It was a good reminder for me as well. And for everyone listening, I pray and hope that it was helpful for you. Appreciate
Mm.
everyone who watched or listened. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much.
If you're looking for more stories that'll inspire you to step out into the call of God in your life, why don't you check out this podcast right here?